Hey guys, Tbull here. Today we're going to be previewing the upcoming seasons of Ranked. That's right, this update cycle we're going to be having 1v1 Ranked matches. It's going to go from tiers 3 up to 4, 5, 6, and then 7. So a lot of, I'm assuming they're probably going to be, maybe weekend type sessions, 2 or 3 days long. But researching what the 1v1 has looked like on the PC made me kind of change my mind. Initially going into this, just kind of thinking about it abstractly, I was thinking, okay, we're going to be on our normal maps. We'll have a big circle in the middle, and cruisers are going to be dominating, especially kiting type cruisers. They can utilize the concealment, move in, get some shots, get some resets on whatever's on the cap. If it's a destroyer, just rush the destroyer. Otherwise, kind of whittle down, whatever. But what they've been doing on the PC, basically it looks like 20%. Like a zoomed in area of the map. So for instance, on some of the PC games I was researching, I saw Land of Fire, Greece, Trident was another one, and it was just kind of like maybe a zoomed in section. A lot of islands typically, but what the map layout looks like, it'll be two circles, and then those circles overlap. So potentially you can capture both circles by being in the section in between them, or you can capture each circle individually. Very quick to capture the bases. I think it was like 15 seconds to capture, and then quick accumulation of the points. 5 seconds, you get your score, but 5 points every 5 seconds. So playing outside of the caps, not an option if we get the same version that the PC version has, which it looks interesting. I mean, hopefully that's what we're going to be seeing, but rather than kind of the flowing long-range cruiser play that I was anticipating dominating, now we got to be examining, okay, what ships are going to be excelling in this type of mode, and it's going to be the ships that do well close range. Okay, so I'm going to break down the nations. I'll just go through them. I'll give you my thoughts on them. Starting off with the Americans, I don't think any of the lines in the Americans are going to be particularly successful. Now, the torpedoes are going to be king in this kind of close quarter combat mode. For the ships that rely on torps, and these destroyers, even though they have good guns for destroyers, fast fire, and usually you can get a lot of damage, the torpedoes tend to be very slow and anemic. And anyone who can dodge these torpedo shots, that's going to be lights out. Okay, so even though we have ships like Farragut, Mayhem, Benson, Fletcher, these are strong destroyers in a regular gameplay, but 1v1, I just don't see them doing as well. Now, of course, in pure destroyer v destroyer fights, they might do well as long as the torpedoes don't come into play. But whenever they get matched against cruisers or battleships, those ships are going to have a lot easier time dodging these anticipated torp strikes. So I'm not seeing a lot of upside on the American destroyers personally. American cruisers, both heavy and light, I'm not seeing much potential either. Now, take something like a Cleveland or Dallas. Cleveland, let's just take a look at the Cleveland, for instance. Yeah, we got a radar. Yeah, we got quick firing guns. If we're matched against destroyers in that Tier 7 season, well, that's going to be great. But going against other cruisers or battleships close range, you don't have the torpedo threat. You don't, of course, have any spotting here, so we can only engage targets that we directly see. And that's going to cut down the utility. I think the heavy cruisers would do a little bit better, but again, just due to the fact that the battleships can utilize the cover to get in close and then just kind of rush them. The lack of the torpedo threat kind of takes those ships out of play for me. Likewise, American battleships, really slow. Okay, yeah, until you get to the North Carolina and the Iowa, those have a little bit more speed, but even those ships aren't the best in terms of maneuverability. Maybe a ship like the Massachusetts, an outstanding secondary threat, could be interesting at the higher tier, the Tier 7 game, but Tier 3, Tier 4, Tier 5, I'm not seeing a lot of promise for those ships there. Destroyers are just going to be able to pick them apart. They can basically just rush them and take them out. So I'm not seeing a lot of upside potential for the Americans in this particular game format. The Japanese, I think the destroyers, for good destroyer players, could potentially be very good. Thinking ships like Isakaze, Kamikaze Tier 4, Akatsuki Tier 6. Those ones have strong enough torpedo threats. They're fast in the water. They cycle quickly on the reload. Even though, that you might have some difficulty against certain ships, especially cruisers, I think those will be pretty decent. So I kind of rate those middle of the pack. The cruisers. Initially, I was going to be all about the Japanese cruisers. Again, going with the more long-range run-and-gun gameplay that I was anticipating. I was planning on running for sure Aoba, maybe Miyoko, maybe even busting out the Megami. But if this is going to be a close-quarter slugfest, these are not the natural environment that these Japanese cruisers want to be playing in. So, assuming it is the close-quarter setup that we've seen on the PC, I think the Japanese cruisers are basically out. You can maybe finagle like an Atago with the the nice forward firing torps, but even that ship can struggle close range, especially if you're stuck with a battleship. Really tough to defend yourself, unlike maybe something like a German cruiser. So for me, I'm just not even going to be looking at those Japanese cruisers at this point in time. The battleships, somewhat interesting. Now they're fairly fast. They got decent secondaries, especially on a lot of them. But the option to have pretty good HE, really the HE on these Japanese battleships is kind of second only to the Brits in terms of the effectiveness. So if we get loaded against a destroyer, we get on the cap, kind of try and anticipate where they are, try and dodge the torp salvo, and then when we get them spotted, go ahead and blast them with the HE. You can maybe even one-shot some of these destroyers close range with that HE. If you drive them off the cap, then of course you can capture both the caps quickly and run up the score and force them to come to you. So I actually think the Japanese battleships will do pretty well in this situation here. Maybe Nagato might struggle if you get into like a Battleship B battleship type of a fight, but other than that, looking up and down the line, I think the Japanese battleships actually going to be pretty good. They do tend to fare pretty well against other battleships as well. Moving on to the Brits here, looking at the destroyers, I think that's an interesting pick. Of course, you do have some sonar at the higher level ones, but it's short range sonar, mostly defensive. Yeah, you got great smokes on them, but you need spotting to utilize those smokes in this mode. So I'm not seeing huge upside. The torpedoes, yeah, you can single fire them, but that's not necessarily the easiest to do, especially in a close quarter combat type of fight. And if you're using the quote-unquote widespread, there is usually enough of a gap to successfully dodge through there. So I'm not putting a lot of money, a lot of stock into the British destroyers personally. Maybe you guys will disagree on that one. But moving on to the cruisers, light cruisers, I don't see any chance whatsoever. I mean, yeah, they got great torpedo firing angles, but defensively, armor-wise, not a lot going on there. The main exception that could be the Edinburgh. Okay, the Edinburgh at tier 7. That one has outstanding armor. It does have the good torpedoes. It has the blistering AP shells. I think Edinburgh would be the exception to that. The heavy cruisers, I think, once again, the Marley at tier 7 is outstanding. The rest of them, not necessarily my favorite. They're fairly clunky. Again, they do have good, successful torpedoes that you could use close range. But other than that, I would say the heavy cruisers, maybe a little bit more luck than the light cruisers personally. But outside of Edinburgh and perhaps Marley, I'm not really giving them too much stock. The battleships could be interesting. Once again, outstanding HE shells if you get into a battleship versus destroyer fight. Assuming you know how to deal with that situation, you can definitely blast those little buggers into oblivion. So that could be pretty interesting. I think the British battleships, if you are going to do a battleship, could be a good option. Very deadly against cruisers. Just pop that AP in there. Battleships, depending on what you're shooting at, you could switch the shells out there. So I think the British battleships could be quite strong. I think Germans, the destroyers are interesting, especially at the higher tiers when you get the sonar going. That could be advantageous, but the torpedoes are relatively slow, not that hard hitting. And again, I think for ships that rely on the torpedoes, the better, and the faster and the harder hitting the torps, the better. So German destroyers, you can try them out. I'm not personally going to be putting a lot of chips on those guys. The cruisers, I think, are interesting. Now, Königsberg, that can struggle close range against battleships. I don't necessarily, even though the Königsberg is one of the strongest ships in the game, I don't know if I'll be going out in tier 4 on that one. But getting into the York and the Hipper, these ships have really outstanding torpedo arcs. They got them on both sides, multiple launchers both sides. These ships, they can do really well. They're tough to dislodge when you get on an island. If your battleship's pushing into your destroyer or cruiser, doesn't matter. You have strength against those type of ships. So I think Hipper, York, Prince Eugene, whatever you want to play there, could be interesting. Königsberg, we'll have to see. I'll probably try it out at least, but just due to the threat that the battleships will be posing, I think that one might be difficult. But if you can find maps that have island cover in the caps, then potentially you can rush the battleships. I just think you know, you can one-shot at Konigsberg from most battleships close range. The battleships themselves, the German battleships, I think are going to be quite interesting. Ships like Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, Tirpitz, these torpedo battleships, I think those are going to be quite strong. Bismarck, also quite strong. That, of course, you have sonar to deal with the destroyers, and then anything that's spotted, you're going to be getting damage from the secondaries and the main gun. So I think the Tier 6 and Tier 7 German battleships up and down the line, quite strong. Even the lower tier German battleships could be interesting, but I'll probably be checking out the battleships, either Scharnhorst, Tirpitz, something like that. Bismarck will probably be checking those ones out. The French... Now, the French destroyers, I think, are going to be outstanding. They got great speed. There's no carrier threat here, so we're not necessarily worried about the lack of the smoke. But we can use the ship's speed, get close to an island, figure out where our enemy is going to be, ambush them, and hit them. The torpedoes tend to be very quick. They're very hard hitting, and often you'll have launches on both sides. So, I think the French destroyers are going to be quite strong in this mode. The cruisers, again, initially I was planning on mixing in maybe a Doogie, maybe an Emily, maybe even a Martel Tier 7, but now that we're talking close quarter combat, not really seeing as much success for those. So I'm not going to be passing, or I will be passing on them personally. The battleships I find to be interesting as well. Now we got good mobility here that's going to help with the close quarter destroyer threat, but there's especially ships like Dunkirk or even Jean Bart, Richelieu, those forward firing type ships could be interesting. Brittany, Lyon, of course these ships do well loading in the HE. Even the Normandy does pretty well, but the Lyon, just think about how many guns if you get a destroyer close range, you got those HE shells loaded in. Boom, you can one-shot those little guys coming at you. So I think the French battleships interesting. They're going to be having the most difficulty in battleship v battleship fights, but other than that, I think that could be an interesting and fun class to play. Moving on to the Russians. The destroyers, once again, I think that'll be pretty good. We got hard-hitting guns, so if we want to get into a fight with destroyers, we can take that on. Cruisers, battleships, well, we got speed, we got HP a lot of times, and we got torpedoes, close range, of course, but if we're all doing a bunch of yellowing and close range combat, I think the Russians could be interesting. Concealment, not going to be as important as I initially was expecting. So I think the Russian, at least the original Russian destroyer line will be quite strong. I think the second one probably won't be quite as strong in this mode. Cruisers could be interesting. I don't think they would do very well in battleship games, so I probably wouldn't wind up playing them. But like a Chop, I have a Shores. At least all the tech tree ships, you know, those will be struggling. But against destroyers close range, or even potentially cruisers, they could be strong. But ships like, what are we talking about? Achakov, that could be a pretty good pick. You know, there's a few of the premium cruisers that we've gotten that would be pretty good. And I think like Riga, Tallinn, those could be, Riga especially, because you can kind of defend yourself. Tallinn's not that easy to defend yourself close range, but Riga, I think, could be quite strong as well. So that'll be interesting. Maybe we'll give a look at some of those ones. But then the battleships, once again, I think will be pretty good. Okay, now, because we're 1v1, it's going to be incumbent on the player. Don't go broadside. That's the biggest weakness of these Russian battleships. But assuming you know what you're doing, you can protect yourself by pointing directly at the target. Cruiser battleship, protect yourself that way. Get into an old-fashioned brawl. And then destroyers, well, you know, you'll have to, that'll be the toughest for the Russian battleships to deal with. But overall, I think they'll be a pretty good pick. So battleship players, you might want to consider looking at the Russians. Italians, now we'll be getting the Italian battleship line, and I don't know that much about it yet. So where to put those, not sure. The cruisers, well, these are kind of an interesting sleeper pick because, you know, what I like to do with these Italian cruisers, use the speed, use the concealment to get into positions that they're not expecting and cause havoc that way. The downside I see is the torps on these very, very slow. Okay, they're about as slow as you can possibly imagine. And the guns, slow reloading, and if they're protecting themselves, they're going to have a hard time dealing with the damage. So, Italian cruisers, I think you could come up with an idea, but in the end, I don't think they're going to end up performing that well. The Italian ship of choice for me, of course, is going to be the Tier 7 Paolo Emilio, the Pablo. YOLO Emilio. That one, you know, that's probably, I could conceive. There's so many ships I would like to try in Tier 7, but I would very easily play the entire season with the YOLO Emilio, have a lot of fun, and probably have a fair amount of success. You got so much HP, you can just rush anything and just slam them with torps point blank range. So outside of destroyers, some of the more gunboat focused ones, I think that ship could pretty much dominate anything it ran against. Pan Asians, could be interesting, especially depending on how you set them up. Radars, smokes. You know, they have the deep water torps, which are quite problematic for both cruisers and battleships because they don't have a lot of time to react to them, and they're hard hitting. And if you put the radar option on there for the destroyer as well, then you can take away the smoke option as well. Of course, you want to have the smoke available for yourself. If you miss the torps and like cruisers rushing you or something like that, that could be a problem. But the Pan Asians could be interesting. So overall, I don't know. I think in general, the more brawly the line, the more able it is to function in a close quarters type of a combat situation. That's where the ships that are going to have the most success. That's what I see happening here. So that's kind of my thoughts on this, guys. I want to hear what you guys happen to think on this. And of course, we'll find out once we actually see the modes. Is this game mode panning out how I'm envisioning it currently? But if it is, I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to it. And I think we're going to have some epic battles. So you guys let me know what your picks are going to be, what you're thinking of going into this, and whatever else you got on your mind in terms of the 1v1 rank. So that's going to do it for that one, guys. Hopefully you did enjoy it. If you did, please hit the thumbs up. New to the channel, consider subscribing. We got lots of World of Warships coming all the time. Questions, comments, leave them below. Love to hear from you guys, and we'll see y'all later. Peace.